I think we are live now. People watching on the chat, please write if you can see us all right. Today we have a lecture about Ukraine and the future of Europe in the framework of our course of Positive Political Economy 2, in which we analyze group choice and collective action. And today we have a very special guest with us. His name is Christian Kaunert. Christian Kaunert is professor of international security at Dublin City University. Is that right, Christian?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And we will make some tests today because I am back in my usual studio after I made some changes, and some things may work, some things may be problematic, but we have many people with us today that are following this discussion on YouTube. There are 43 concurrent viewers at the moment. Please give us some feedback. Tell us if you can hear the sound all right. I will start with a question for our guest, Christian Kaunert. Could you please introduce yourself to us? Tell us a little bit about your activity as a professor in Dublin and also in Wales, and also all the European projects that you manage, because as I understand, you are currently managing 5 different Jean Monnet projects supported by the European Union. Please tell us a little bit about you so that we use that as a kind of introduction.
Many thanks, Diego, for having me with you today. It's a great pleasure to be back with you and to have our little discussion that we have had on occasions before. So I'm very grateful and very honored. Just to introduce myself very briefly, so as you rightly say, I'm Professor of International Security at Dublin City University in Ireland, and I'm also Professor of Policing and Security at the University of South Wales in the United Kingdom. And as part of that, I work on a number of projects, of course, but if we were to specifically point out the Jean Monnet funded projects, I'm directing the Jean Monnet Center Virtue. So many thanks to the European Commission for that. And I'm also directing the Jean Monnet module EU Hybrid, that perhaps also fits very neatly in our discussion about Ukraine and the future of Europe. I'm also directing the Jean Monnet network on EU counterterrorism, EUCTER. If you're interested in our activities there, please feel free to go on the website www.eucter.net. And I'm also directing a Jean Monnet chair on EU counterterrorism, as well as a teacher training EU academy. Also, thanks to the European Commission for funding all those projects.
Just a second. Olha Gladchuk from Chernivtsi National University says good day, also on the chat.
Thank you. So kind.
So, Christian, you are a professor of political science specialized in security, and you have been working for a long time in the field of European Union security in particular, and with a special interest for internal security. In the last time you dealt a lot with problems related to terrorism, since the Twin Towers incident and all the increased interest about terrorist problems globally. You have proposed studies in the field of EU counterterrorism. You are director of this global European Union funded network of EU counterterrorism. the problem that brings us together today is about Ukraine and the future of Europe. The crisis in Ukraine is a challenge for the European Union. And the first question that I would like to ask you is a question that many people have been asking lately in the news. And they have asked this question, for instance, to President Macron of France, and they have asked the same question to President Biden of the United States. The question is, do you think that Vladimir Putin, that started this war in Ukraine, do you think that he's rational?
Yes, I mean, that's an interesting question because, of course, here you see whether you're analyzing this analytically or whether you're analyzing this emotionally. I think when you take it purely analytically and what the definition of irrationality, or sometimes they call him madman or other kind of terms that are being used to describe President Putin, then we're talking about a clinical description of whether somebody is indeed crazy or whether somebody is indeed irrational as such. And I think if we're looking at it purely analytically, we cannot suggest that indeed he's acting irrationally. What we can very clearly say is that his logic of rationality is not the same logic that we apply in Europe, and is not the same logic that perhaps we apply in the West more generally speaking. His logic is very clear. His logic is that, and he's been saying it over many, many years, that he regrets the demise of the Soviet Union. He wants to re-establish the kind of order that existed during the Soviet Union. It's a kind of nostalgia, if you like, to hark back to, as he perceives it, the good old times of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, as we have to also admit, that was, despite its own construction, was of course a somewhat imperial construction, an imperial construction that Russia constructed for itself, which superficially relied on equality of all the different union states, but of course wasn't completely reliant on that logic, because of course Russia was at the dominant force in that union, and was using the Soviet Union as an amplifier for its own imperial ideas. And very clearly here, he's harking back to those times, and he wants to re-establish the old order that pre-existed the fall of the Berlin Wall, an old order where Russia was the second superpower in the world, where Russia was calling the shots in large parts of Eastern Europe, where Russia was the dominant power in Central Asia, where Russia was the dominant power in large chunks of the world, and this is what he wants to reestablish. Now, if we look at Russian history, we can clearly see that Ukraine was always at the heart of that imperial conquest. If we look at the history of Russia and Ukraine, of course, Ukraine, Kiev in particular, the Rus, it's all part of the Russian mythology of what it is to be part of the Russian world. In fact, the cradle of Russian civilization as such was created in Kiev before Moscow, St. Petersburg even existed. And this self-image of Russia as this imperial power is something that is intimately and very, very intensely linked to Ukraine. So from his perspective, he's trying to regain what he felt that Russia is due and what he felt that Russia has had before. And in fact, during the times of the Soviet Union, it did have that kind of conquest. The problem for him is, of course, that on the Ukrainian side, this is not seen in that way. On the Ukrainian side, there is not this perception that they're indeed part of the Russian world. And if we look at their perception post the attack on Ukraine, we see that with every step that he's taken to bring Ukraine closer to Russia again, he's alienated more and more people in Ukraine and has
I think we have some technical problems. The connection we had has been interrupted. So the question, I don't know if you can still hear us. Puteți să mă ascultați, să-mi dați un feedback, pentru că au fost unele întreruperi aici, pe parcurs, și nu știu dacă se aude. Se aude, Viviana?
So we lost each other there. Sorry about that.
Yes, it was a brief interruption in the connection. I don't know if it was on your side or my side, because I'm also having problems here on my side, and I'm not sure what may be causing this problem. But just a second, you can continue. So your main idea was that even if we do not agree with Putin's intentions, we can understand that he has a certain agenda. He tries to maximize certain preferences that he has, so he could not be considered technically irrational. We may disagree with what he tries to do, but he acts rationally. But my second question now is whether the EU is rational in its dealing with Putin in the question of Ukraine. Because one of the tenets of rationality is to have clear preferences, clear transitive preferences, to know what you want. And the EU sometimes gives the impression that it doesn't know what it wants out of this crisis. Could you please elaborate a little bit about this?
Yes, no, I mean, on the whole, you can on the whole, you can call the EU action, of course, rational, because the EU has objectives, and their objectives are primarily to push Putin out of Ukraine. They aim to sanction his regime in order to increase the costs for Russia for this particular war, and to push them back to the borders. So I think that in itself is, of course, a rational objective. So the EU is acting rationally in that sense. Where it gets a little bit more complicated with the EU is, of course, that the EU is a collective organization where preferences converge between the different member states and also the EU institutions, but they're not always identical, right? So what we're seeing in the EU is a more complicated construction of a European position, of a European interest, of a European objective. But given the severeness of what the EU is aiming to do, we can say that the EU has made great progress. If we compare this to, for instance, the EU action in the 1990s with the Yugoslav wars, if we compare this to, in general, EU action to big security events, we can see that there was relatively swift move towards creating a clearer European objective, one that, as you say, is not always 100% clear, because that is not in the nature of the EU as a collective organization to be always 100% clear. There's always different voices within the system that are perhaps seeing things a little bit differently. But overall, the EU, for instance, I give you an example, had to
Din nou, cred că s-a întrerupt conexiunea. Poate problema nu este doar la noi, poate este și conexiunea cu Marea Britanie, de unde cred că astăzi se conectează invitatul nostru, dar voi mă auziți pe mine încă, cred, să-mi dați un feedback dacă pe mine mă auziți. Sunt acum multe persoane conectate. Hello?
Hi, sorry about that. That seems to be happening again.
Yes, it's the connection is being interrupted, but now we are back on air. There are many people, 75 people that are watching our live stream now, and they are very interested in what you are saying. They can also write on the chat. They can ask questions for you, and certainly they will have questions later on. So if I were to summarize, we started with Putin's rationality, if he knew what he wanted or not. Then we discussed the EU's rationality, if the EU knows what it wants. And you said that in spite of the great challenges that it has being a collective organization to try to aggregate different preferences, that it seems to have built a common objective in what regards Ukraine. My question is about this difficulty to find common ground in the EU, and what are, in your opinion, the main sources of conflict between member state governments to agree on a common stance on Ukraine?
Yes. So there's a variety of different factors here. One factor is very clearly the closeness of certain governments to the Russian government or not. So clearly, if we take one extreme, we have a Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is probably perceived as the most close of all the politicians to the Russian government. And he's been staying as neutral as he can in the entire conflict, while at the same time still adopting all of the sanctions that have been adopted as part of the European Union, alongside all the other member states. So we have this, and on the other hand, we have, of course, other EU member states that are not as close as Hungary to the Russian government, that are on the other side of the spectrum. But of course, there's also great in between, and that is individual politicians within this kind of spectrum.
Just a question related to this. You said that one of the main sources of difference is different closeness of the governments with the Kremlin. And you cited Hungary as a case in point. My question now is particularly about Germany and the SPD government. How would you define the current closeness of this government with the Kremlin?
It's a more complicated one because, as you know, in Germany we have a tripartite government. We have three parties that are members of the governing coalition. We have the Social Democrats on the one hand, that are at the moment occupying the chancellery with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And we have the two smaller parties, although the Greens are not so much smaller than the Social Democrats. We have the Greens on the one hand, who also have the foreign ministry with Annalena Baerbock, and also the economy ministry. And we have the Liberals, who are mainly in charge of the state finances and have the finance minister Lindner. And we have a number of different voices in the German government. I think it's very clear that the Social Democrats historically have always been much, much closer to the Kremlin than a number of the other parties. This is long established, if you like. Former West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, with his Ostpolitik, was already much, much closer. He was, in fact, the one who started the building of pipelines to the then Soviet Union into Germany and into Western Europe and so on. So his idea was, the whole idea of Ostpolitik was, in a sense, Wandel durch Handel. That was the slogan, change through trade, so that by trading more with the Soviet Union, you would eventually get far more change in their behavior. So the Social Democrats are very clearly much closer position to the Kremlin. Most clearly exemplified by former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who sits in fact as part of the board of a number of different organizations of the Russian Federation. He's part of the Gazprom board. He was the part of the board also of the pipelines on a number of other Russian companies. So he's very, very close to the Russians. And he was, in fact, over a number of years flying to, over a number of months flying to the Kremlin, also speaking with Putin after his attack on a number of occasions. So much so that the Social Democrats were starting to feel embarrassed by his closeness to the Kremlin and started instigating a process to remove him as a party member from the Social Democrats. Now, this hasn't happened yet. So far, this process is ongoing, but at some point, this process was started. Now, what's important to mention in this regard is that, of course, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he used to be the General Secretary of the Social Democrats under Gerhard Schröder, so he was the party manager, if you like, of the Social Democrats under the Chancellor Gerhard Schröder at the time, so he was always very close. And the idea in Germany is very clearly that Gerhard Schröder has a particularly close connection also to the Chancellery of today. So that this is very clear. On the other hand, we have the Greens and Annalena Baerbock, for instance, who's been a very vocal critic of the Russian Federation, who in her position always wanted to go much, much further than the Chancellor and wanted to have much stricter sanctions on Russia. And the Liberals at the same time, under Lindner, who are also much, much more critical of Russia and also wanted to have a much, much more stricter approach, I guess, on the Kremlin and wanted to diversify energy much more strongly. But the way to get there is, of course, something that's been very, very difficult for the German government. But what you could say is that the current German government is perhaps partially close to the Kremlin, but not as close as previous governments might have been, and certainly not as close as Gerhard Schröder's government would have been in the 2000s.
Okay, so you introduced this topic of Ostpolitik, and you mentioned the creation of pipelines with Russia. And I would like also to mention this idea of integration through trade, and which is an idea that has also applied to the European Union as a project to integrate the EU through the common market. And this relates to two current events. One of them is the attack on the Crimea Bridge, this on the Kerch Strait, this mega construction there that was the pride of the Kremlin. It's also a great way of linking the East and the West. And also this Nord Stream 2 pipeline and these recent attacks, apparently three incidents, three explosions probably, that have this not destroyed, but they have disrupted this Nord Stream pipeline. So my question is, if you believe that these kinds of works, these kinds of bridges and pipelines are a good thing or they are a mistake for the future of Europe?
I think you can't generalize. I think it's situational. I think the idea in principle of Wandel durch Handel is not a bad idea. In principle, indeed, as you rightly say, inside of the European Union, we have achieved a closeness between EU member states through increased trade, through removing barriers to trade that didn't exist prior to the invention of the European Community, European Economic Community, and of course the European Union eventually. And as a result of that, there's something that certainly holds true in that idea. I think it is, but I think perhaps what has been underestimated by a number of politicians is the fact that on both sides there needs to be a certain willingness to achieve that objective. And usually that is easier when you are dealing with two democracies, when you're dealing with two democracies that are in fact aiming to stabilize their political system by being close with one another. So the example for that would be Germany and France as democratic actors that are bringing a certain closeness and stability to the European Union, because by being close with one another, they're also stabilizing their own political system. Now, when it comes to the EU and Russia, things were a little bit more complicated, because certainly on the Russian side, the whole idea was perceived a little bit differently than on the European side. On the Russian side, for instance, when Europe started its European neighborhood policy and started developing relations with Ukraine and with other countries, they also invited Russia to be part of this. They also wanted an association agreement with Russia. But it was Russia, in fact, that didn't want that at the time. They didn't want an association agreement. They suggested that they don't want to be a minor power, minor player like, for instance, Ukraine, like Georgia and a number of other countries. They wanted something that takes true account of the size of Russia. That was the overt expectation. I think the implicit explanation is, of course, that Russia did not want this because Russia did not perceive association with Europe as an opportunity to build those bridges that we've just discussed, but Russia perceived it as a threat. Russia perceived it as a threat because it perceived this as Europe democratizing the backyard of the former Soviet Union, and eventually that kind of color revolution would start to enter the Russian space as well, and perhaps this would be a regime threat to the Russian government itself. And as such, the idea of what was to happen was not shared on both sides. So it's difficult to build those bridges when the ideas are not shared. And the Russians at the time didn't want this. The EU then pushed to create the so-called four spaces with Russia. That was a very specific agreement that was only targeted on Russia. But when Russia initially then intervened in Crimea and occupied Crimea, the EU stopped that policy, and we didn't have any continuation of that policy, if you like. So we haven't returned back to the status that we had before, of course, and it is unlikely to return anytime soon. So in that sense, the policy itself is not necessarily a mistake, but you need to be certain that on both sides, you're aiming for the same objectives here. And clearly, the Russians didn't see this as an opportunity. They saw it as a threat, precisely a threat to regime security. And under conditions where your partner is perceiving you as a threat rather than as an opportunity, it's very difficult to build those kind of bridges.
Okay, so we have discussed this idea that the first source of conflict, in your opinion, is the different closeness of different member state governments to the Kremlin, and historically, but also temporarily due to the current government in power in each of those countries. So, in a sense, you are saying that it's not only about the idea of a permanent national interest, it's also about the influence of domestic politics on the formation of foreign policy. Is that right?
Yes, for sure. There's a clear influence of domestic politics and a clear influence of specific domestic actors that are acting specific ways to in a sense, bring themselves into that creation of a foreign policy objective. I think it's very clear that this idea of permanent national interest is something that academics probably subscribe to. I think practitioners don't see it like that. I think practitioners see an interest, a national interest, is something ever evolving and constantly being constructed and reconstructed. And in the same way, a European interest is always constructed and reconstructed with every decision that we have at the European level by the various actors that are involved at that particular moment to construct it. And in the same way, we have that also at the domestic level. So this idea that we have, like Mersheimer would have, and the realists, that we have a permanent national interest, I don't think this really exists. I don't think we have a permanent national interest. We have long-term interests, that is true. And we have long-term, in a sense, long-term objective material conditions that influence the formulation of your domestic national interest. And obviously they play into this. So for instance, the accessibility to relatively cheap energy is one of those long-term interests. So that is very clear. And this is something why Europe was finding it so difficult initially to move away from Russian gas, because a lot of the economy was depending on it. And it constructed this in such a way that they were dependent.
If it still works, right? I will ask on the chat while you speak. So the question you just discussed now, it was about this influence of domestic politics in the formation of the foreign policy, if I recall right. Mm-hmm. And you discussed about the national interest, but related to the national interest, you mentioned the importance of energy sources, importance for the economy. And related to this, I would like to ask you if this energy problem, energy policy, is currently also an important source of conflict between the member state governments. And in particular, this idea of the need for energy for the well-being of the economy on the one hand, but on the other hand, this quest for a green energy and this importance for some member state governments that not only to have sufficient energy, but also that the energy is from a green origin, right? Yeah. And my question is about this discussion, this German experiment to close down the nuclear plants and to move entirely or to rely very heavily on natural gas, and on the other hand, the insistence of the government of France that nuclear power should be considered a green energy. So my question is, if you consider that nuclear power can be made into a green energy, and if you think that that is the solution to the energy policy of the European Union as proposed apparently by the French government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's start with the German decision why to close down nuclear power plants. At the time, you remember there was this big accident in Japan, which led to the perception in the German political scene that nuclear energy is unsafe. Because of that particular accident that resulted in the tsunami that we had in Japan, there was this perception nuclear is unsafe. And thanks to that general public perception, the German Greens that were at the time in opposition under Angela Merkel's government, they really started to rise in the opinion polls. They rose very, very, very significantly. So Angela Merkel, despite the fact that she didn't have to take that decision because it's none of her coalition partners that really wanted her to take that decision, but she took that decision to, in a sense, remove nuclear energy from one of the German energy mixes, to close down the nuclear power plants in order to neutralize politically the Greens, who then subsequently, she was right, politically the Greens went down, but of course not long term, they just went down temporarily, long-term, the Greens are still at quite a high level of importance in the German political scene. And when Angela Merkel resigned as German Chancellor, in fact, that really pushed increasingly also the Greens in terms of the domestic popularity. Now, is that necessarily the best approach? I think that depends a little bit where you're sitting. From the Greens' perspective, they've always argued, of course, that nuclear energy is an unsafe technology. That's, in a sense, the foundational idea of why the Greens even came into the scene in the 1970s, at the time also as part of that particular crisis in the aftermath of oil blockage that the Arab countries were putting on Europe at the time in the 1970s. So their foundation rests on that idea that nuclear is unsafe. Now, when we look at experts, they're telling us, and I'm not a nuclear scientist, so I cannot tell you whether that is really safe or unsafe, but what they seem to be saying is, yes, there are some residual problems with nuclear energy, and that is notably how to dispose of the waste from nuclear facilities. But in the interim, nuclear does not produce CO2 and therefore does not have that negative impact on the environment, which is what the French are then saying, why, in a sense, nuclear is an important, at least what they might call it, bridging technology to make the European economy go from one that is based very, very heavily on fossil fuel towards a future that is much, much more environmental, because, as you know, environmental energy at this particular moment does not take a majority in any European country's energy mix at this particular point. And so in order to get to that point, in order to invest significantly to get to that point, you need a certain bridging technology. Now, Germany at the time decided that that bridging should be done through Russian gas. Now, that retrospectively, geopolitically speaking, was a big mistake. Geopolitically speaking, it made Germany much, much more dependent on Russian gas, and it gave Russia the impression that it has a lot more power over Europe than perhaps it actually did have, because ultimately Germany moved away from Russian gas subsequent to the attack on Ukraine, perhaps not as fast as others would have liked it to move, but there was a very clear move away from that. And in fact, there's an element of not closing down the last remaining nuclear power plants in Germany and so on. But of course, the amount of German power plants that we're talking about, this is just 3 nuclear power plants, whereas if we look at the amount of nuclear power plants in France, we see that there's a huge amount more than that in France. So over time, there could be a move for different European countries to use nuclear more as a bridging energy source in order to eventually get to a more environmentally friendly energy. And that's what the French are hoping, and that's what the French are pushing for. In the German domestic political scene, it's difficult to get there, though, because the Greens are very strongly anti-nuclear, and that is something that will not change regardless of what the future government will look like. Because just imagine we had fresh national elections in Germany tomorrow. We might have a different government, but that government might be CDU and the Greens. It wouldn't be excluding the Greens from a future government, which means that it's unlikely that a future government in Germany could just go on a big nuclear expansion like the French have done. That is not something that in the German political scene you're likely to expect in the next couple of years. I don't think so. I think you can see Germany moving away from Russian gas, yes, but I think that will not lead to a massive expansion of nuclear in Germany at this point in time, even though there's merit to the French argument that nuclear is potentially a good bridging energy source.
Okay, so you had mentioned initially that inside the German government there were differences between the parties, the 3 parties that formed the coalition, and you said that the SPD was traditionally closer to the Kremlin, but you mentioned that the Greens and the foreign minister Baerbock was a little more critical with the Kremlin. On the other hand, it seems that it's the Greens that are pressing for the closing down of the nuclear plants and for using this natural gas as this kind of bridge energy until the renewables are able to provide all the amount of energy necessary for the economy. You said that Baerbock was more pro-Western. On the other hand, there are other people that say that the Greens in Germany, they are more like a watermelon party. Mm-hmm. They are green on the outside and red in the inside. Mm-hmm. So my question is, when you discuss this influence of national politics in the formation of a German foreign policy, if you really consider that the SPD is closer to the Kremlin than the Greens?
I think overall, yes. I think I would still maintain that. I think you're right in saying that the Greens clearly they don't want to have nuclear. I'm not sure that necessarily it follows that the Greens necessarily would want to have an expansion of natural gas. I don't think that's necessarily their position. I think their position is that we move much more heavily in the environmental energy and that we have much stronger investment in the environmental energy. I think that would be their idea, and that we're using the bridging energy far less, and that we accept in the interim to have higher energy prices, something that perhaps not everybody on the German political scene would be ready to accept. Neither the Social Democrats nor the Christian Democrats would be ready to accept much higher energy prices, and probably German industry wouldn't be ready to accept that either. But on the whole, I think for sure there's a generational divide also in the Green Party. The traditional Greens, like Jürgen Trittin, for instance, they would be far more left-wing than the current generation of Green leaders like Annalena Baerbock and so on. I'm not saying that they're not left. They are, of course, left. That is their political stance. But when it comes to a clear strategic orientation, they're also very clearly pro-EU. They're also very clearly pro-NATO. And in fact, some of the strongest supporters of providing weapons to Ukraine from Germany have been from the Green Party. They have not been from the Liberal Party, and they have not been from the Social Democratic Party. They have been primarily from the Green Party, some of the strongest supporters of weapons for Ukraine. So I think we can safely say that the Greens are in the orientation very strongly pro-Western as we see it right now. They have their ideas about nuclear, but that is, in a sense, all political parties don't necessarily make sense in all of their policies if you put them together. You know, this is something that we find in every political party in every Western country. But this is notwithstanding that they have a very clear pro-EU and very clear pro-NATO stance, which is something that has changed a lot. You know, if we go back to the Greens of the 1990s, there was not that clarity of having a pro-NATO strategic orientation as we have it today. That is something that has changed very significantly from the 1990s.
This brings us to a very important final question, which is about what you just mentioned of providing weapons for Ukraine. It's about EU direct involvement in the war in Ukraine. And we have discussed so far differences of opinion inside Europe, also differences inside member states as sources of conflict that make it difficult to aggregate the preferences and to create a common foreign policy for the EU. But even in the cases when there is a common preferences in Europe, even in the case when all the member states of the European Union could agree that the EU should be involved more in the Ukrainian war and should step up its assistance, military assistance to Ukraine. Even in that case, there can be a second source of conflict, which is who pays for that? How will be that financed? Because there are many voices in Europe, even in the United States, that are calling for the German government to provide Leopard tanks or to provide different technologies that sometimes the German government would be very happy to produce and provide for Ukraine. But the question remains that these technologies are very expensive, and who pays for them? So even though we all agree that we would like to step up the military assistance to Ukraine, do you think there's like a collective action problem nowadays in the European Union that makes it difficult for it to act more decisively?
Well, I think in every political situation, there's, of course, in the EU, a certain element of a collective action problem. But I think here, when it relates specifically to who pays for the military equipment, what we find is that it goes unnoticed that Germany is already the third largest payer to Ukrainian weapons after the United States and the United Kingdom. Germany is already much ahead of France and a number of other European countries, even bigger than a number of European countries put together. So Germany is already paying very, very heavily for Ukrainian weapons in a way that other European countries are not. But this goes unnoticed because, of course, there's other problems with German policy towards Ukraine, like, for instance, not providing enough weaponry. The Ukrainians have been mentioning that point over and over, that they want some heavy weaponry from Germany, like you say, the tanks and so on, which the German government has been very, very careful so far not to provide, partially because of the symbolic image that German tanks would be fighting in the former Soviet space, in particular in Ukraine, where there's a lot of historical memories from the Second World War. So that is something that the German government has been very careful, because they didn't want to be used for future Nazi propaganda about, the Nazis are marching on Moscow again, that type of propaganda that clearly the Russians would be using if Germany were to provide those type of weapons. Partially, it's been problematic because, of course, also other countries like the United States and Britain even were a little bit hesitant to provide some of those weaponry because, in a sense, they were expecting that there would be some sort of Russian escalation to the war, which seems to be happening as we speak. So I think Western European countries are becoming much, much more ready to provide those kind of heavy weapons that we were discussing before. I think we're probably going to see German tanks for Ukraine fairly soon, because I think the escalation that the Russians have been conducting over the last couple of weeks is probably going to lead to that outcome, that there will be more and heavier weaponry for Ukraine. But it is important to point out that, in fact, a lot of European countries, and Germany amongst them, have already been providing quite a lot in terms of financing that weaponry and providing also some weaponry directly to Ukraine. So I think we will expect much more of that in the next couple of weeks, I think.
So I think maybe the public would have some questions. If so, they can write them on the chat, and I would transmit them to you. As final thoughts about this topic of Ukraine in the future of Europe, this is another crisis for the EU. And when I discussed with you about this lecture, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, we talked about a potential challenge for the EU on the migration side. Some people are mentioning the possibility of a second wave, second big wave of migrants before the winter, related precisely to the attacks, the Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure.
Yes.
So could you please discuss a little bit about this threat?
Yes, I mean, if we look at those attacks that have been happening even today on Kiev and a number of other Ukrainian cities, we see one common denominator. From a perspective of taking over that territory by Russia, they make no military sense. They're not happening because Russia is at the moment thinking it has a serious chance of taking over Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. They're happening to specifically target infrastructure, to make the winter as unappealing for Ukrainians as you possibly can, to terrorize the population into either immediate submission or into leaving Ukraine. So a lot of this, what Russia is doing at the moment, is to, in a sense, create a second wave of refugees into the European Union in order to then undermine the European support for Ukraine, specifically the support when it comes to weapons, when it comes to finances, when it comes to a lot of support that the EU is providing for Ukraine in order to keep the Ukrainian state alive. And by doing that, have such a miserable winter for Ukraine that eventually, after the winter, Ukrainian politicians might be ready to either resign entirely or at least to accept to give up some of the Ukrainian territories to Russia so that Russia can then call this a military victory, even though militarily they didn't actually achieve their objective, but they could then claim their limited military objectives in eastern Ukraine have been fulfilled, so that they won the war and Ukraine. So this is the point of those particular attacks. Whether they will be successful will depend on the reaction of Europe, will depend on the reaction also in particular of the United States, especially after the congressional and Senate elections that we will have fairly soon. Will that change the domestic political scene in the United States? That will perhaps undermine American support for Ukraine also. That is possible, and that is perhaps also something that the Russians are banking on at the moment, that with a change in majorities in US Congress, we might see an undermining. But this is also happening on the Democratic side. We've seen a number on the far left of the Democratic Party in the United States also agitating against some of the support that the American government is providing to Ukraine. So the whole political domestic scene in the United States is also going to become more complicated for US President Biden. But ultimately, we shouldn't forget that in the United States, it's the American president that calls the shots on foreign policy matters. And that means that even though it might make it harder for him to take the decisions that he's currently taking, he's probably likely to continue to take the decisions that he's taken so far. And that probably provides good news. If we look at the UK domestic political scene, we see that even with the new government, we don't see any significant change in terms of stance towards the support of Ukraine. So that is unlikely to change in the near future. But of course, Europe has certain vulnerabilities, and migration and refugee crisis is one of those vulnerabilities that the Russians clearly want to use to undermine the support for Ukraine.
And finally, now I promise one final question. We have discussed the sources of conflict, closeness to the Kremlin, energy, and we have discussed the current challenges of the war in Ukraine, how to finance the European Union assistance. We have discussed also the potential migration challenge that the EU could be facing this winter. But the final question relates to your main area of interest, of academic interest and specialization, which is terrorism. Mm-hmm. It has been sometimes the experience when there are military conflicts, like the ones in Chechnya in the past, or even more recently, or closer to the EU in the case of the Balkans, that this has created another type of migration that is a challenge also in the field of security, because the migration that we have been seeing so far, these refugees from Ukraine, are usually families, females with young children, sometimes elderly people. But the problem is, if this war in Ukraine will create for the future another type of migration that could have greater security implications for Europe. If you think that the conflict in the armed conflict in Ukraine can have an impact on European security in the future, similarly to how the military intervention by the Kremlin in Chechnya has created the rise of terrorist groups in the region and their international contacts. Do you think that the war in Ukraine could create a similar kind of terrorist problem in Europe?
Yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. If you look at former conflicts in particular, what comes to mind is a conflict in Bosnia, what comes to mind is a conflict in Afghanistan. What we see very often is that foreign terrorist fighters, they go from one conflict to the next. So for instance, we had movement from a conflict in Bosnia to the conflict in Afghanistan. We then have movement from a conflict in Afghanistan and also to the conflict in Syria. And we clearly have movement from a conflict in Syria to the conflict in Ukraine. So the possibility that Ukraine could become a kind of European Afghanistan, or at least part of Ukraine, I'm not saying the whole of Ukraine, but certainly that the fact that the conflict is there, and then the eastern parts that are governed by Russia and where foreign terrorist fighters would be well trained in those kind of areas, is a very problematic area for the whole of Europe. We are likely to see very well trained military fighters who over time will come back to Europe once the conflict is over, because those people have certain set of skills, and that set of skills needs to be applied somewhere, right? And there will be people who are ready to apply that set of skills and pay for it. And that is potentially a problem for the European Union in the years to come, because there will be on both sides a set of heavily trained and very well in a sense, trained set of fighters who could eventually end up in the European Union also, and unlikely, it could also end up somewhere else close to Europe, for instance, new establishment of a new conflict in Bosnia, for instance, or somewhere close to the European Union, or they could also come inside the European Union and really conduct their attacks also inside of the European Union. That is a definite possibility. I think it's something that we need to watch out for, and that's why we need to do a lot more to understand the movement of foreign terrorist fighters in the conflict in Ukraine. So that is something that will be something to watch for in the future, but it's something that is quite likely to happen, in fact.
Great. We have to bring the live stream to a close because we have already exceeded our scheduled time of 1 hour for this live stream. But there's one question from the public, from Bobok Stefan. And he asks about Nord Stream pipelines. If he asks, what if it just broke down on its own without having been attacked? And he says that there are no real proofs that it was sabotaged by anyone in particular, right? So I think this question is an interesting one relating to who are the authors of this incident in the Nord Stream pipelines. The second question is by Alexandru Makovei, asking if you think there can be an attack on the Republic of Moldova in the future by the Russians, similar to the one that happened in Ukraine. So these are the two questions that have been just posted on the chat by the students who are watching your intervention today. If you could please take some of these questions, we would be very thankful.
On the first question of the pipelines, these pipelines are not infrastructure that can be easily attacked. They're very, very deep under the sea. So that is something that only certain actors have the capacity to attack them. And in fact, while the general public will not be shown the proof of this, the problem is far more widespread than just the attacking of that particular pipeline. There have been attacks on a number of internet network cables. There have been attacks by the Russians on a variety of European infrastructure that has largely already happened, and that is not widely advertised in the European media because, of course, there's an element of wanting to create panic amongst the European population. But these attacks are very clearly designed by Russia. They have been conducted by Russia, and that they are far more widespread than just the ones that have been mentioned in the media so far. So what has happened so far is already much, much more widespread than what has been reported in the media. And there is enough proof that it is the Russians that have done this. It's just that the Western governments don't necessarily want to advertise that particular proof because it doesn't lead to calm and rational decision making, because it would create certain panic amongst European population. On the second question, could an attack happen on Moldova? I think very clearly it could happen, but it depends a little bit on what the Russian military advance is like. If Russia thinks it is likely to reach Odessa, if militarily they can reach Odessa, then they're likely to bring in military force also from Moldova. In order to do that, they would need to take over Moldova first, but that wouldn't take them more than a couple of days to take over Moldova. That could be achieved very quickly with the kind of military force that is already in Moldova, in Transnistria in particular. The Russians wouldn't have too much of a problem to take over Moldova. But at this particular moment, there's no military incentive for them to do so, because with that particular force, they have no chance of reaching Odessa and taking over Odessa. I think they would only attack Moldova if there's any chance at all that they could take over Odessa and cut off the whole of Ukraine from the Black Sea. If they can achieve that, they're likely to take over Moldova. If they can't achieve that, they're not likely to take over Moldova anytime soon, but they could.
There are two additional questions. 3, 4, many questions are arriving now at the moment. One question is about the end of this conflict. There are two related questions. Kalin Ilie asks if they could be ended peacefully, if there's a chance that this conflict ends up in peace. Or another question by Alina Bunduk, if this conflict can end up in a third world war. And then there are other questions that I will read to you later. So this is about the end of the conflict. If you think that at the point we are now, there are chances that the conflict will end up peacefully, or else it could end up in a more serious, more global conflict, in a third world war.
Yes. So the first question in terms of, is there a possibility, will this end peacefully? I think we're past the point where this could have been ended to a certain extent through a certain withdrawal of Russia and having maybe some very, very limited military victories that would both sides to keep face. I think we're beyond that point. I think President Putin cannot withdraw and still remain in power. I think that's impossible. The Ukrainians cannot accept that he takes over a sixth of their country. So that means eventually there will be a military solution. I don't think there can be a political solution anymore in that conflict. Does that mean that there's a possibility of an outbreak of the Third World War? I think that is definitely a possibility. Certainly we're itching towards that. And if you saw the recent statements by President Putin in the Valdai summit, you clearly see that he entertains that idea with a lot of vigor. He is convinced eventually there's going to be a war between Russia and the West, and he's even pushing in that particular direction. And that could eventually become a much, much larger war. I mean, we're already seeing Iran being involved, helping Russia. We're seeing China, for now, only in the background, not really directly supporting military action, but we could see a lot of things escalating eventually, especially if Russia were to use nuclear weapons. We could certainly see that escalation towards a Third World War. So this is a possibility. It's one that I don't want, and I hope that it won't come to it. But it is something that is possible, certainly also when we believe the rhetoric that is coming out of Moscow at this particular moment. And I think we should take their rhetoric seriously. I don't think they're just bluffing in terms of what they say. When it comes to some of the other questions, let me see there's so many of them. I'm not sure which one I should focus on because I think I can't really.
Yes, there's one question that you have already answered, which was about Transnistria by Andra Axinte. You already answered the question that Russia could take over Moldova easily if the time comes when it's in their interests. But the other questions are broader questions. One question is about China and the position of China in the current conflict. If this will make China stronger in Eurasia, this conflict. And there's also another question about Central Europe and the fact that some EU governments are closer to the Kremlin in this conflict. If this is a challenge for European Union security in the future, if there could similar conflicts start in the Central European region.
Yes. I'll start with China and then I'll go to the European leaders. China, very clearly, China could eventually become involved in a conflict. But when you see it from a Chinese national interest, Russia needs to be very careful what is happening because Russia has pushed a lot of its military away from Asia into Europe and into the Ukrainian military theater in particular, which means that Russia on its eastern front is extremely vulnerable if China were to use the situation to annex large chunks of Russia. Should this evolve into an escalating conflict between the West and Russia, possibly something like a Second World War, I'm not convinced that China is necessarily on Russia's side. I think Russia is extremely vulnerable on its eastern front, and that extreme vulnerability could potentially mean that China could actually take large chunks of Russia, something that China could do very, very easily militarily. It just needs the political will to actually do that. But militarily, it wouldn't have much of a problem in actually doing it. So I would be very careful to necessarily suggest that China is definitely part on the Russian side. Should this escalate into the Third World War, I think there's every possibility that China would act in its own national interest, which may not actually be to support Russia in this particular war. Then, in terms of European leaders, yes, this is clearly a problem, but I think the European Union is starting to take actions. For instance, the kind of positions that Gerhard Schröder held in Gazprom and so on, they've now been outlawed. So that makes it much less attractive for future European leaders to be so close to the Kremlin because they cannot actually as easily be bribed as they were in the past, which means that things will get a little bit more challenging to influence the European political scene in the same way as whatever happened over the last 20 to 30 years, which means I think long-term Europe is starting to sort its act out. But in the interim, of course, this is still a potential problem for the European Union security. But long-term, I think Europe is about to address those issues, and I think they will be addressed in the medium term.
There are so many and so good questions now, and I would like to read some of them to you. You can choose if you answer them. One question is by Lavinia Andone, whether the energy problem in Europe is a structural problem that will make this war last longer. It's not something, a temporary problem, it's a long-lasting differences in energy that will make the problem more difficult to solve in the future. And then there are many other questions by Bobok, by Sonia, and by Alexi. Several students they think that I would like to ask you whether this conflict could degenerate into a nuclear war. And what do you think about this in the current situation in which the nuclear arsenal of the countries of the world is so well stocked?
Yeah. So in terms of the nuclear question, I think it's not the most likely scenario for the future that there will be a nuclear conflict, because there's still a huge element of deterrence involved in nuclear weapons. So I think also from a Russian perspective, even if political decision-making moves towards using nuclear, there will still be military generals who will be very hesitant because they understand the implications of using nuclear weapons. One of the implications notably being a very, very strong military response by the United States in case the nuclear weapons are used, and the degeneration into a full nuclear conflict. Now that implication would be so huge that even Russian military generals might be persuaded that this isn't a good idea. But that doesn't mean that we can exclude the risk of that happening. I think we need to be conscious of the risk, and we need to act in such a way as to prevent that if we possibly can. I mean, the main actor here is clearly the Russian government, but that doesn't mean that Western countries shouldn't, in a sense, try to stop it if somehow they can. In terms of the energy and the long-term prospects, clearly energy is a very complicated subject, and changing the supply of energy is something that doesn't happen overnight. We've seen it in the 1970s when the Arab oil boycott for Western Europe was obviously very, very harmful for the European economy. We're going to see something similar, maybe not as bad, because of course now the energy sources are more diversified in Europe than they were in the 1970s. But we're going to see economic problems that derive from this particular energy conflict. But at the same time, as we've seen in the 1970s, those things also are, in a sense, they act a little bit as an accelerator. So the kind of developments that we saw in the European Union towards greener energy, they're probably going to be accelerated. They're probably likely to be combined to a certain extent, at least in some European countries, by nuclear energy, and France will be pushing a lot for that, and France will be one of the main beneficiaries of that outcome. But it's not structural in the sense that it cannot be overcome. It will be overcome, but it's not something that can happen overnight. It's something that we're looking at a 5 to 10 years time horizon. But eventually, this will be a problem that will be solved also.
Okay, there were some other questions. Some of them are repeated about the China, if it's preparing for a bigger war, or if there can be conflicts inside the European continent in other places. But there's an interesting question by Kalin Lee related to the European Union and Ukraine. Do you think that the European Union will accept Ukraine as a member?
I think yes. I think as long as Ukraine can survive this war and it continues to exist beyond this war, and it looks increasingly likely that this will be the case, then I think the European Union will be almost on an obligation to accept Ukraine as a member state, having undergone such a tremendous horror of this war as a consequence of trying to get closer to Europe, and such a tremendous threat to its existence, I think it is very likely. And what we've heard from some quarters of German politicians, they seem to be willing to extend the invitation of the European Union further than what is currently already discussed. So currently we have countries such as obviously Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, that were sort of encouraged to work more closely to the European Union. And just yesterday, I heard some German politicians suggesting that this should extend further into Central Asia with Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and other Central Asian countries that perhaps should be encouraged to get much closer to the European Union as well. I think this is a direct outcome of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Nobody in the European political scene would have dared to think in that direction without that invasion of Ukraine. But now those ideas are clearly being pushed as a consequence. And I think this means that Ukraine will be an almost certainty to be accepted into the European Union in the years to come.
Okay. I propose that we leave it at that, on that final positive note, that Ukraine will eventually, and very probably sooner than later, become a member of the European Union. Thank you very much, Professor Christian Kaunert from Dublin City University and the University of South Wales, for participating in this lecture. Thank you also to the European Commission and all the sponsoring organizations that make it possible for you to research on these issues and also to disseminate the results of your research with the wider community, such as today. And you are welcome anytime that you would like to participate again in one of our lectures.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure to be there with you.
Thank you.
Great.